Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome, everyone. There are some times when your job is a pleasure, and there are some times when your job is a great pleasure. And today, really, it's my great pleasure to introduce Rich DeMillo, who's going to speak to us on a topic which I think we'll all find very interesting. He has a very illustrious background, and you can find that background in the description of this meeting invitation, which includes everything from being directors of computer centers to the dean at Georgia Tech, to serving as his first chief technology officer at Hewlett-Packard. And with all those credentials, though, I think we're going to be stimulated most about what he's learned through a lifetime of service in our industry and our academia. And so please, Rich, please join us.
Thanks, Earl. Thank you. It's good to be here today. So where to start? This is a group that has been around universities a lot. Let me just start by saying this is a really interesting time to be talking about this subject. It seems like every time you read a newspaper, flip on a cable news channel, there's some piece of information or misinformation floating around about higher education. We just passed $1 trillion in student debt, if you can believe that. If you take out home mortgages, it's the largest source of personal indebtedness in the United States. Penn State has let the lure of $70 million in cash flow a year get in the way of their mission. I just saw a YouTube video called The Great College Conspiracy that has, at last count, 3 million views. And it's a 1 hour rant that charges higher education as an institution with all sorts of deeds. Some of the charges are true, some of them are not. But 3 million views on YouTube is, by any measure, a lot of people looking at higher education. And of course, we have presidential candidates that are making all kinds of statements about the state of colleges. It's all happening in a backdrop of what I think of as kind of swirling invention. And the thing that bothers me the most about it is that a lot of innovation in education in general, but higher education in particular, my profession in particular, is taking place outside universities. So things like the Khan Academy. Who would have thought that some guy with a lot of cousins could set up a video camera in a broom closet, literally, and produce a couple thousand knowledge bursts that are viewed by millions of people, and have come to reshape how people think about what goes on in the classroom. 1 billion new students are being added to the worldwide population of students. 300 million alone in India. Declining public support for the university. So I'm going to come back to all of these. As a backdrop, it's hard to find a better time, maybe a worse time, to be talking about where institutions are going. My comments are focused to a large extent on American universities, but as we were just discussing a few minutes ago, American universities are a bellwether for higher education around the world. So whatever we're seeing here, for good or ill, is going to affect the way the world thinks about its colleges and universities. And I guess if I had to characterize all the things that I've mentioned up until now, there's a lot of opinion out there. Most of it is unformed opinion. A lot of it is uninformed opinion, but most of the opinion is unformed. It's easy to find people that can write opinion pieces, make cable news commentary by cherry-picking facts about higher education. It's really hard to find someone who has looked at what is going on in the nation's colleges and universities and draw some conclusions about it. And that's the book that I wrote. It wasn't the book that I started to write when I stepped down as dean at Georgia Tech in 2008. I did what deans are supposed to do. You're supposed to write a valedictory. So I wrote a 5-page memo to my president, you know, being a careful guy, I said, well, before I send this to the president of the university, I think I'll send it to some colleagues to see what they think about it. I started getting notes back from people saying, well, I don't believe this. Or, you know, can you explain this here? So my 5-page memo turned into a 10-page memo, which turned into a 50-page, I don't know what it was, 100-page white paper is what it turned out to be. And I set it aside at that point, not thinking very much about it, and was in the process of selling a manuscript for a completely different book to my publisher, MIT Press, and my editor just happened to ask one afternoon, so what else are you working on? And I said, well, not much. I just have this 100-page thing about universities, and that discussion turned into this book. But even at the point in which I decided to write a book that partially summarized my experiences as a dean, partially looked ahead to higher education as an institution, I really thought I was writing as a professor for other professors. And it wasn't until I went to literally a neighborhood cocktail party. And I live in a neighborhood where everyone is college educated. Some people have advanced degrees. Some of them had been on my advisory board, I'm embarrassed to say. And I would have had a lot of insight as to what makes universities work, why they work the way they do. And they'd say, what are you working on? I'd say, I've got this book that I'm working on. And 30 seconds into the conversation, eyes would glaze over. And I could tell that they had no idea what I was talking about. They didn't understand why it costs so much. They didn't understand why no one that goes to a public institution can complete in 4 years. They didn't understand any of the things that drive us crazy when we look at universities. And there wasn't very much that was coming out of universities to explain that. After all, if universities had been spectacularly successful at explaining what their value is and why they're in the shape that they're in, we probably would have better public support for our institutions. But we're not very good at doing that. So at that point, my project took a right turn, and I decided to write a book, not for academics, but a book for general audiences about universities. Why are they the way they are? Where are they going? What can be done about it? So what were people asking me? It's a cocktail party conversation. What were people asking me? I think the number one question is, why does it cost so much? If you just look at the cost of higher education, the price of higher education compared to consumer price index, it's growing at an annual rate that's about 4 times consumer price index, twice. This is over a long period of time now, twice healthcare costs. Why are the outcomes so bad? Everyone hears stories about Cornell. Any Cornell graduates in the room? Everyone hears stories about Cornell graduates flipping burgers. And those are the stories that get propagated through, and also Georgia Tech graduates. Those are the stories that get propagated through these conversations. Why can't I understand what's going on? Is it worth it? I don't mind paying money for my kids tuition if I know that there is some sense in which that tuition is going to be paid back either in economic terms or some other terms. And those discussions are extraordinarily difficult to have. Why can't higher ed change? Why can't universities change? We've seen every other industry in the world change or be changed. Why can't higher education change? And there's a lot out there that I would call easy fixes with easy answers to what's going on. So, for example, there's a common conversation, a common meme that floats through cable news programs that says that the easy availability of federal loans is driving up the cost of college. It's basically an assertion without any data behind it. In fact, there's an easy argument that shows you why that can't possibly be true. Most Pell Grants go to profit-making institutions. Profit-making institutions live and die on their ability to extract profits from student tuitions. Their costs aren't going up dramatically, and yet you find in public institutions on an annual basis 9% annually tuition increases over the last 8 or 9 years, where private institutions have basically held their costs in check. So you have for-profits that are holding their costs at a constant amount. You have publics that are growing at basically 10% a year, and you have private universities whose costs are constant. And for none of these institutions has spending increased. So you have all possible outcomes of this experiment. Which one of them is consistent with the idea that the ready availability of Pell Grants is driving up costs? None of them. Now, it doesn't matter which side of that argument you take. None of those is consistent with the idea that Pell Grants is driving up the cost of college tuition. Yes?
Is that on a per student basis?
This is all macro. Every number I'm giving you is sort of a macroeconomic number.
So could it be that the public institutions are just taking on larger and larger student pools? Or?
No. And in fact, we'll come back to this in a few minutes. But just to kind of look ahead to what the real driver is. The real driver is loss of income. Over the last 2 generations, public institutions have undergone massive mission creep. They've undertaken more and more things that are outside the core mission of a university. Everything from technology licensing offices to running hotels, and hiring $7 million basketball coaches, in my institution's instance. When support is going up, you can hide a lot in the annual increase in revenue. When local legislators start to cut the amount of support, and you decide not to cut any of those ancillary things, you have to go someplace to recover those funds. And the only place that's available, the only fungible source of free cash in the system, is in the tuition that is paid from a relatively small number of zip codes. And if you wanted a single answer, what's driving up the cost of tuition, mission creep would be the number one. There's almost no, if you take a look at the top 15 drivers of increased cost, increased tuition, there's almost no new spending category in that first 15. People say, well, it's faculty salaries. Faculty salaries don't even make the top 15. And they certainly haven't increased. So lots of easy answers to questions, lots of easy fixes, most of which are uninformed by data. And most of which, by the way, represent deeply held beliefs on the part of university administrators and boards of trustees, who are probably the least well informed as to what the actual data looks like. So what's with the title of this book? Let me first of all talk about that. Abelard to Apple. So Peter Abelard was an 11th century French monk, arguably the first true university professor, although he never worked at a university. He was charismatic figure, scholar, kind of an iconoclast, I guess. Not kind of an iconoclast. I mean, his masterwork is a treatise called Yes and No. And what he did is he quoted ecclesiastical authorities who had taken both sides of propositions to point out inconsistencies. But at some level, he was teaching the art of argumentation and rhetoric to his students. Well, as you might imagine, this was not something that the church elders took kindly to. And it ultimately was his undoing. Peter Abelard is mainly known because he was half of the famous love affair of Abelard and Heloise. And it didn't end well for either one of them. It ended less well for Peter Abelard, I would say, than Heloise. She wound up in a convent, and he wound up being castrated. So it wasn't a great outcome. But it was a style of interaction with students that really molded the first universities. He drew thousands of students to his lectures. And Apple refers to Apple Computer, and I have to say I know exactly where I'm talking today. And the only reason that Microsoft isn't in the title of the book is that all of the people that were in the equivalence class of Peter Abelard had names that began with A. Aquinas, Anselm, Abelard. So if there had been a Saint Mickey, maybe the title of the book would have been different. The Apple in the title refers, of course, to iTunes U, which is a style of interaction between master teachers and students that we still are not sure how is going to play out, but it does represent a new way of connecting between charismatic, sometimes iconoclastic teachers and masses of students who feel that they can connect with their professors, independent of the value that the institution provides, and that's a key point. So the book is, to a large extent, an essay about the value of higher education that follows this historical arc from Peter Abelard, 11th century, to iTunes U in the 21st century. The subtitle is "The Fate of American Colleges and Universities." What is the fate of American colleges and universities? It's embarrassing to say, embarrassing to have to make the argument, but the fate of American colleges and universities is to be subject to the same political, economic, geographic forces as every other human institution. And that's a simple fact that colors this entire discussion, because there are forces in higher education that absolutely don't believe that's true. In the face of all data, in the face of all rational argument, they think that they are an entity unto themselves. And the book talks a lot, not about what's going to destroy higher education, how bleak things look, but talks about this fact of being subject to forces that are inescapable to any human endeavor. So I wanted to get people talking, and this is the framework for getting people talking about higher education. It's been it's been a gratifying experience for me, because I had expected, for example, that my colleagues would just hate the idea of this book. This isn't a tell-all book. I mean, there's some parting of curtains that takes place, but I'm not really writing a book of secrets. here, and I would have thought that my colleagues would have taken some of the more controversial aspects of the book and run with them, but they haven't. And I would have thought that people from various political stripes, economic stripes, would have had very different takes on what I have to say about higher education, and that really hasn't been the case. Conservatives and liberals react approximately the same way to the things that we're going to talk about. If there's any pushback at all to the subject matter, I think it comes from, it's kind of an unexpected source. It comes from my colleagues in humanities and liberal arts. And there's if you haven't seen Stanley Fish's Chautauqua lecture sermon this summer, where he argues, without me in the room, I might point out, against the premise of my book. The premise is that how dare you try to assign an economic value to something that has an obviously inherent value of its own, and it's a fair point, but it's in some sense a silly point. People who have thought about universities and their role in society for the last 1,000 years or so have had this recurring discussion about what is the value of a university. And in fact, the last really important person to talk about it was not Stanley Fish, but John Henry Cardinal Newman, the founder of University College Dublin, maybe the most important influencer of higher education in Europe in the last 200 years. And when he stepped down from his presidency in Dublin, he wrote a treatise called The Value of a University. And he kept writing the same book over and over again for the next 30 years. And the thing he kept coming back to was this idea of what is the value of education? What is the value of a university? What's the value of a university curriculum? And the compelling argument that Newman made, which seems to me to sort of settle the issue, is that you can agree that the liberal arts education has a value that is in some sense self-evident. It doesn't need to justify itself. But there are many, many things that are worth doing on their own right. It's an argument that Locke made. Many things that are worth doing on their own right. And in fact, there are so many things that are worth doing that you can't possibly do them all. So we can accept that all of the things that go on in a generally liberal education are worth doing. But it doesn't help you at all, because you have to make choices. Some things go in, some things come out. And as soon as you start making choices, you have to assign a value, assuming that you don't make the choices at random. And once you start assigning a value, you're into economics, and you've assigned an economic value to an education. So this idea that somehow universities can escape the conundrum of having to justify themselves on the basis of some value. I'm not talking necessarily about dollar and cents value. Some value proposition just seems to me to be a way of avoiding an important discussion. So I mentioned a few minutes ago about the kinds of misinformation that I see floating around out here. What is it that we want to talk about? How do you cut through what people think is going on in our institutions and get to the heart of the matter? So there's a discussion that's taking place in a lot of media right now about the number of people that are going to college. Are too many people going to college? It's a fair question. And you can argue on the basis of all kinds of political beliefs about whether or not they are. Maybe we're sending too many college graduates to low-paying jobs, or it really never comes back to them in terms of salary earned, for example, when compared to the amount of tuition that they pay. Remarkably, no one until this year has done the obvious economic study. How many people should we be sending to college? It's a guy named Anthony Carnevale at Georgetown University just did what, since I'm not an economist, what I would do, and anyone who first thought about the problem, he'd look at the supply and demand for college graduates based on publicly available data. So he just looked at consumption of people with degrees versus production of people with degrees, without making a lot of distinctions about where the people were from, what they were studying, or where the jobs were. And it turns out, using robust statistics, that the U.S. has been underproducing college graduates to the tune of about 0.5% a year for a long time, 40 years. So if you just did the strict arithmetic, we're probably short 20 million college graduates today in terms of what the economy can consume. So it's a simple argument. It's the kind of thing where you could look at the data that's available and say, well, the argument that says that we're overproducing college graduates can't be true because we have been underproducing for the last 40 years. And then the overlay to that is the argument that says that, well, college graduates are ending up in jobs that don't require college training. Inconveniently for that argument, there's a classification of skill levels that the Department of Labor does that keeps track of what kinds of people fill those jobs. So low-skilled jobs, retail sales, flipping burgers, jobs that could either require a high school education or not, depending on the job. Jobs that have higher skill levels, and then the most skilled positions. So at the bottom of that hierarchy, the unskilled jobs. Yeah, there are in fact positions that are being filled by people with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees from reputable institutions, but not many. 1.7%. And it turns out that even those people are better off than people without a college education. The moral of the story is that if you're going to be a retail sales clerk at Old Navy, you're better off being a retail sales clerk with a bachelor's degree from NYU than not, because you're going to earn more of your lifetime. Your possibilities for advancement and lifetime earnings are enhanced. Most people with college degrees end up in the top two levels: the highly skilled, the skilled levels. Now, it matters a lot what you study, of course. Not surprisingly, it matters a lot what you study. If you're a petroleum engineer, you are in relatively more demand than someone who majors in pre-Hellenic cultures. It's just a fact of life. But even when you look across all possible majors, the rates of employment and unemployment between people with college degrees and those who don't have college degrees is striking. There's also a divergence in terms of economic rewards, economic inequities, depending on how you look at things. So by and large, the United States is diverging into two distinct populations based on what you've studied and where you've studied it, what zip code you grew up in, and it's an economic inequity that just continues out for the foreseeable future. There's also a lot of discussion about some of the things that I called mission creep, that people think are really essential part of a university. Research, for example. So we're in one of the cathedrals of research here. It's not always the case that a university needs to conduct a program of sponsored research to be a university. Scholarship and sponsored research are not the same thing. And in fact, there's an assumption floating around most administrations that says that I can increase my bottom line as a university if I go after federal research contracts, if I go after industrial research contracts. With a handful of exceptions, it is simply not true. With a handful of exceptions, it costs a university $2.50 to bring in every dollar of sponsored research. And it's not rocket science to get to that number. Just look at the cost of sales for a university research grant. $2.50 for every dollar. I'm not talking about overhead. I'm not talking about the cost of administrators. I'm simply talking about the direct costs to the institution at going after those federal funds. Which means what? Which means that if you don't have research as part of your mission, and there are very few institutions in this country that have research built into their mission statements. If you don't have research as part of your mission, you have to come up with those funds from someplace else. The only place to come up with those funds is instruction. It's the only fungible part of the budget, since you're not going to give up football and hotels. And since you don't have subsidies for those instructional funds, you have to go back to students and raise tuitions in order to cover that. So this vicious cycle of an entitled set of activities that have nothing to do with the core activities of the institution being funded on the backs of students just continues on and on. Let me kind of jump to one of the central ideas in the book. It's the idea that the higher education system in this country, increasingly around the world, is a class system. It's kind of an intellectually jarring notion. We think of universities as being meritocracies, egalitarian, all of the democratic, all the things that we'd like to think of our institutions. It turns out, of course, that it's simply not true, that higher education is a class system. At the top, the ruling classes are the 60 or so elite institutions that kind of guide everyone's thought about higher education. These are, a good share of them are members of the American Association of Universities, the top research institutions, or the elite undergraduate liberal arts colleges like Williams College. At the other end of the spectrum is sort of a hodgepodge of stuff. For-profit universities, a good example of what that hodgepodge looks like. University of Phoenix, Savannah College of Art and Design. All of these places that are kind of outside anyone's pale of what it means to be a quality institution. The interesting thing is that both of those extremes are doing pretty well. The elite institutions are doing just fine. You know, Harvard's endowment goes down a few billions of dollars as the market fluctuates, and University of Phoenix has to contract its growth rate from 15% to 12% annually computed. But they sort of know what they're doing, and they're charging down their own path. In the middle, and in fact, it's what in the book I call the middle, are somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. And the fact that we can only narrow it to within 1,000 institutions tells you a lot about higher education. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 institutions that are neither elite nor doing just fine, thank you. They're living hand to mouth. They live on tuition to the tune of about 90% a year, sometimes 95% a year. They don't have large endowments to rely on, and their only hope to move to a more stable economic situation is to move up in the class system, either to become a research institution or to become more selective or to raise tuitions. That's the group that I'm talking about. It's the bulk of higher education in this country. it's the part of higher education that I talk about when I talk about the fate of American colleges in universities. It educates 80% of our students. So 80% of our students are locked into this thing that I call the middle. And I want to read just an excerpt from the book that talks about the middle, because this is to a large extent what's going on in the middle, and why we're having this discussion today. So the chapter is called "Beware the Well-Oiled Machine." So Linda's first challenge when she was named department head was to reform the curriculum. Students were required to take the introductory courses in her department that were appropriate for their majors. This requirement meant that the instructional workload for the introductory teachers amounted to thousands of credit hours per year, many more contact hours than would be consistent with effective mentoring. Over time, the department had figured out how to cope with such a high workload. They decided to become a sort of factory. Part-time instructors, usually retired professionals, were handed an hour-by-hour lesson plan and a large stack of overhead transparencies for recitation to 100 freshmen. Projects were carried out in smaller groups under the supervision of teaching assistants, many of them undergraduates themselves. Tenure-track faculty members had virtually no contact with freshmen, and there was no faculty supervision of the introductory course sequence. A student services organization, staffed by non-faculty academic professionals and advisors, oversaw the entire operation, which consumed a sizable fraction of the department's operating budget. By 2002, the results were indisputable. A cheating scandal was exposed to the glare of national media. Lab assignments and projects designed as a rite of passage by upperclassmen and graduate students required an unreasonable amount of time to complete and were wildly out of sync with the academic goals of most students. Student complaints far exceeded any other unit on campus, and the attrition rate for students in Linda's department was well above 50%. Even worse, the introductory courses alienated female students. Male teaching assistants assigned projects by gender. Women were assigned writing and documentation tasks. Men were assigned leadership roles. Female enrollment was a full 10 points lower than the national average and 20 points below the levels of other departments in the university. Open-ended comments from students confirmed that there were few mature guiding hands in the introductory courses. Linda's first step was to hire Mark, a respected senior professor who had a reputation as a sort of turnaround expert, to guide the reorganization of student services. Mark began to review operations of the Student Services Organization, but longtime staffers immediately warned him that he should not mess around with how things were currently being done because it's a well-oiled machine. It was a revelation. Even the support staff thought of themselves as workers on the factory floor, and the learning spaces reflected it. Students hung out on long wooden benches in a large lobby area with a shabby green carpet. To get to instructors' offices, students had to pass under a hand-lettered sign that said swamp. This was a remarkably effective setup for the students who chose to remain, but students, on campus and off, were choosing other paths in increasingly large numbers. Student service staff members received consistently high marks from their supervisors during annual performance reviews. It did not take Mark long to figure out why the supervisors loved the well-oiled machine. The cost of instruction for the introductory courses was low, and advisors effectively moved the few students who chose to remain through the program without a lot of hassle. Accreditation teams routinely approved the curriculum without requiring much from the department. And best of all, the tenured faculty members were rarely bothered with undergraduates. While students, alumni, and an alarmed public were letting Mark know that the well-oiled machine was not doing its job, the department's research reputation continued to rise in the national rankings. In the strange accounting of the middle, things were going well. So if there was ever a metaphor for what's going on in those 2,000 institutions, that is it. So what is going on? Higher education is a multi-sided market. There's no single determining factor. Is it an economic bubble? Yes, has many of the same characteristics as an economic bubble. It's a rapidly growing marketplace, highly fragmented, and it is in the hands of incumbents. And at a time when economics, technology is driving the pace of change, being an incumbent is an exceedingly bad thing to be in a growing marketplace. And that's where higher education is today. So what can you say about all of this? There are a few things that I want to leave you with. One is, and I spend a fair amount of time towards the end of the book talking about this. The university system in the United States became great because of experimentation. And in fact, if you trace the history from Abelard to Apple, there's a series of points of punctuated equilibria where experimentation just seems to flourish from nowhere. So at the end of the Renaissance, for example, European universities were moribund. Universities at the medieval universities at the end of the Renaissance had long since run their course. They weren't attractive to business people. They were called openly in the press obsolete homes of outmoded knowledge, I think is the term that they used, until the Jesuits, quite by accident, decided, well, why don't we run an experiment? Why don't we run an institution that uses their textbooks but actually teaches people what they want to know? And the academies in Northern Europe did the same thing. So there was a burst of invention that took place in Europe that fundamentally changed higher education. So in the U.S., this occurred after World War II. If we just kind of track the number of universities, in medieval times there were dozens of universities. By the end of the Renaissance, there were hundreds of universities. By the time the Civil War ended, there was a burst of thousands of universities. Most of them were, frankly, unsustainable experiments. Sectarian schools that were held hostage to various churches, kind of narrowly defined institutions. But in that same period of time, you had the Morrill Act. So you had the appearance of land-grant colleges, which for the first time tied the idea of a university degree to a job. Why do we have the Morrill Act? Because there are things that a growing country needs to do that can only be done by a university education. It's a genuinely new concept. And it resulted in a spurt of universities. You had, during that same period of time, Johns Hopkins, so the invention of the modern research university. You had Tufts. You had Williams College. You had Amherst. You had Mills College. So you had all of the institutions that we think of as being the great institutions, but of course there were thousands of others that were experiments that failed. But that's how we got to where we are right now. Experimentation in this country basically stopped in 1960. I don't care what measure you choose. There has been no increase in capacity in the American higher education system since 1960. Small institution here or there. That's about it. There's been precisely one new research university since the turn of the century. Anybody know what it is? UC Merced. And UC Merced is on life support at the moment because its bigger cousins are sort of sucking all the oxygen in the wake of the California economic crisis.
When did Santa Cruz get started?
Probably around that time. Santa Cruz was 60, yeah. So, who is experimenting? Well, Indians are experimenting, for one thing. Kapil for good or ill, has promised the Indian people 27,000 new universities over the next 10 years. 27,000. It's an easy number to get to. India currently sends somewhere between 11 and 12% of its high school graduates to university. To be internationally competitive, that number has to be closer to 50%. That over the next 10 years is about 300 million students. So if you take medium-sized universities, 10,000 student universities, that gets you to about 30,000 universities. Now, how do you do that? How do you open dozens of new institutions a week over the next 10 years? You can't. You can't. So they have to have a different notion of what it means to be a university. And China is in exactly the same boat. There was just an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education this morning about the rapid rise in the quality of Asian universities. So using Western measures of quality, you see a dramatic move of Asian universities into the upper quality clusters. It's all the result of experimentation. And in the US, as I said, we've stopped experimentation. So what is the path forward? A lot of things can go into where we should be heading as a country, where as institutions we should be heading. A lot of the things you know about here, things like open learning are going to play a key role. Why? Because open learning is an unquestionably good idea? No, because open learning is an experiment. Open learning will enable dozens, maybe hundreds of experiments of the kind that couldn't take place if you had to rely on bricks and mortar institutions. Open certification. I take accreditation agencies to task in my book. I think I'm being pretty harsh. I've had colleagues that accuse me of throwing my punches. Do we really need to spend 8 cents of every Stanford tuition dollar on accreditation? Does that end up, in any sense, translating to value in a Stanford degree? It's a system that is built on a parasitic industry that at its basis has good roots. Rockefeller and Carnegie needed to know that their foundation money was being well spent 100 years ago. And that's where the accreditation agencies came from today. But an institution like Georgia Tech is beholden to 40 separate accreditation agencies, none of which add value to a Georgia Tech degree. So we know what it takes. I mentioned the growing marketplace. We know what it takes in a growing marketplace to be successful. You have to have, this is the lesson of dozens and dozens of technology revolutions, business revolutions. You have to have a compelling value proposition, a compelling brand, a compelling price. It helps if you have all three, but if you don't have at least one of those, you're in trouble. In higher education today, those 2,000 or 3,000 institutions in the middle don't have any of those. I end up giving a version of this talk for leadership groups for a lot of university presidents, and one of the games that we play is to haul out strategic plans, and I'll just kind of X out the names of the institutions of the strategic plans and mix them up, and ask provosts and presidents, can you pick your own strategic plan out? And by and large, you can't, because strategic plans of universities are interchangeable. They promise to be empowering. They promise to provide values. They promise things that are generic across any institution, but not specific to any particular part of their mission. There are exceptions, of course. For every 100 institutions like that, you have a Harvey Mudd that says that we are going to take engineering students, science students, make them skilled policymakers. We're going to make them skilled in the liberal arts. We're going to make them skilled in the humanities. We're going to teach them how to communicate about what they know about science and technology. Or Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech has the highest in the country in terms of percent return on investment, annual return on investment over 30 years, the highest of any institution in the country, 14%. If you wanted a good investment, it's hard to find over 30 years something that returns 14%. A Georgia Tech tuition returns 14%. And for all we say about Georgia Tech's growth as a research institution, the reason students come to Georgia Tech is that the great bulk of the students who have no desire to be PhD level scientists know that they're going to leave being smart, competitive, tested engineers who can walk into any engineering organization in the world and succeed. That's a value proposition. And we make a big deal about it. I don't end the book with a lot of discussion about here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do. I did, when the book was done, I did feel that I had to leave readers with some sense of what the framework was. And so there is in chapter 20 of the book a set of rules of the road. And there are 10 of them. I'm not going to talk about them in detail here, other than to say that they really divide the strategic choices that a university president has or a legislature has into two pieces. One is to know your value. One is to define your value proposition as an institution. If you can't do that in this growing marketplace of 1 billion new students, then you probably won't survive intact. And once you've done that, you have to think about architecting an institution that delivers that value. And that's the hard part, because that requires presidents to carry out unnatural acts. They have to violate, Clay Christensen has this nice analogy in The Innovator's Dilemma of the irrational act that an innovator has to go through. You have to abandon something that's been successful for you in the past and jump to a technology, a business, a market that has many risks associated with it and may fail. What president gets rewarded for doing that? Not many, but there are a few. And I talk about some of them in the book. So let me finish. I didn't talk I didn't talk anything about technology, and the book doesn't spend a lot of time talking about technology, which is good because most discussion of technology in higher education is misguided. It assumes. Well, it assumes that none of us have read Nicholas Carr. So it assumes that none of us have read the idea that IT doesn't really matter if you don't know what you're doing to begin with. So automating a 16th century curriculum still gives you a 16th century curriculum. But there are some directions that technology can take you. There are some things that we know are probably going to be required that technology enables. The Abelard to Apple story is to a large extent the journey from a monolithic one-size-fits-all curriculum to a specialized curriculum. But we stopped that with the appearance of majors, because we didn't have platforms that would allow universities to operate with a kind of curriculum that was more finely subdivided than majors. But today we do. Today, technology enables the kind of personalized delivery of education that we see being discussed in medicine, for example. So personalized delivery of a university degree now becomes possible. We're not quite sure how to do it, but it becomes possible. And to some extent, it's the only thing that we should be thinking about in terms of technology. There's a much ignored paper by Benjamin Bloom. Everybody know who Benjamin Bloom is? The Bloom taxonomy? Well, it turns out that Bloom and his colleagues did a meta-study in 1984 of the effects of different styles of classroom instruction. So he looked back at the last 50 years of data and said, well, let's clump styles of classroom instruction into 3 categories. There's traditional classroom instruction. So someone like me gets up in front of the room, goes like this. You give a test, students either pass or fail. We'll call that the normal classroom. Then there's something called the master classroom. Someone like me gets up in front of the room and goes like this. You give a test, and you retest and retest and retest until students learn the material, or at least pass the test. That's called the mastery form of classroom instruction. And then there's one-on-one tutoring, which is what it sounds like. You have a single Peter Abelard with a small number of students, maybe not one student, but a small number of students to mentor them. So Bloom looked at the data across 50 years, as much data as he could gather. And if you look at normal classroom instruction, the outcomes are a bell-shaped curve. You get lots of people in the middle. The tails are relatively light. When you move to a master classroom, that bell-shaped curve is shifted a little bit to the right. So people perform better if they're made to do the assessment until they actually learn the material. The shocking thing for Bloom was that if this had been a clinical trial, they would have had to stop the trial. The shocking thing for Bloom was that tutor-based instruction moved everyone to the 98th percentile. It's a 2 sigma difference. In fact, it's called the 2 sigma problem. The only thing that we know that is quantifiably the best thing to do in the classroom is to get rid of the goddamn classroom and replace it with Peter Abelard. Replace it with a tutor. Now, that was considered to be a completely unrealistic goal, because how do you have a Peter Abelard for 30,000 students at a large public university? Now we have technology that mediates that. I've got this great video from, and it happens very quickly. I've got this great video from HP about 1998, 1999. Amazon had just been distributing widely for a couple of years at that point. And HP was supplying the servers for Amazon. And there's this great commercial where a car pulls up in front of an obviously closed mall. And a guy gets out and he kind of peers in the door, kind of confused because the mall is closed. And another car pulls up and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "It's closed." The policeman pulls up and says, "What are you guys doing here?" He says, "This mall is closed." And of course, the message is that Amazon is a mall that never closes. That was 2 years into the e-commerce revolution. And already it had been an infectious idea in the marketplace that you could have a different kind of customer experience, mediated by technology. And the idea that we can have a different kind of student experience mediated by technology that essentially solves Bloom's 2 sigma problem, I think is not beyond reach. And you can see it in the Silicon Valley startups, Udacity, Coursera, the venture-backed companies that are using a heavy combination of machine learning and AI to deliver a more personalized experience. And we are less than the first generation into that. So if I had to put all my eggs in any technology basket, that would be the basket that it would be in. Once we start gathering analytics on millions upon millions of student hours of classroom experience, and we know what it means for a mouse to hover over a review question for 10 seconds longer than the average, then you start getting the kind of real-time feedback that it takes to make decisions that affect large numbers of students. So I think I'll stop there. There is, just to return to the kind of the dark aspect of the book, there is a discussion at the end of the book that what happens if you decide that you as an institution want to kind of go on current course and speed, and the outlook is not great. The outlook is not great. There's a discussion at the end of the book at what happened when Antioch College closed. Antioch College, founded by Horace Mann. In many respects, the beacon of progressive educational thought in the U.S. for 100 years. Closed. By the time it closed, its endowment had shrunk to $5 million. Its freshman class was 20 students. Its entire enrollment was 500 students. What happened? Antioch College had implemented a strategic plan 5 years before that essentially created a funnel for anyone that wanted to enter Antioch College, a kind of orthodoxy chute that you had to go through, and unless you went through that chute, you were not going to be admitted as an Antioch student. When they announced they were going to close, the AAUP was called in. They did an audit. They found great fault with university governance. Never once in the AAUP report was there a mention of the role that the strategic plan played in closing Antioch's college. And again, that's a metaphor for why institutions don't change. So, Harold, thank you.
We have time for questions, so please.
I'm here for 2 days.
I think you raised a lot of really interesting points, and you referred also to Clayton Christensen's Center for American Progress report, which I thought was very interesting in this space as well. So one of the things I'm wondering about that he talked about a lot as well is that, I absolutely agree with the numbers that these middles are really kind of losing out. They don't have great propositions, they don't have great outcomes. What's interesting is that some of the Phoenix University-like places and community colleges that are offering online distance education kinds of things are actually starting to eat their lunch, right, because they actually have better outcomes per dollar than some of these middles do. And I'm wondering, and it's kind of what's been interesting to me is that some of the most innovative things are kind of not coming from the Stanford and MIT things, but are coming from these community colleges, that are doing like different forms of discussion and whatnot. And I wonder, what do you think the potential for real innovation coming from?
Well, you would hope that it would be a source of innovation. My big fear for community colleges is that they're stuck in the same envy model that everyone else has. The NSF budget for community colleges has gone from essentially zero when I was at NSF, exactly zero when I was at NSF, to 200 million today. So there's 200 million research dollars flowing to community colleges. Now, some of this is for educational reform. It's hard to argue with that, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of it is straight heads-up competition with research institutions for peer-reviewed research. So you can tell what's happening. Clark Kerr, the great University of California president who coined the term multiversity, talked about this idea of mission creep, how it's always in the interest of trustees, of presidents to move up in the Carnegie classification. And that's what's happening in community colleges. The state of Georgia has no more community colleges. We used to have a great community college system in Georgia. Now we have four-year colleges and technical colleges, and every one of those four-year colleges is trying to move up the food chain. So you would like to look at what's going on at the community colleges and take lessons away from that, and you kind of keep your fingers crossed that they're going to be there as a source of examples. On the other side, the for-profits are still looked on with great disdain by traditional universities, sometimes for unrealistic reasons. Because they're for-profit, as if those of us with endowments don't earn profits. Sometimes because they accept from zip codes that most of us wouldn't touch. They accept a kind of student that we wouldn't accept. But demographics is working in their favor. By 2020. Extrapolating, do a straight line extrapolation of current trends. A majority of college students will be outside the 18 to 24-year-old demographic. That is 25 years old or above. What does that say? It says that if you've built your reputation, if you've built your value proposition on dormitories and fraternity houses and football and climbing walls, you're probably not going to hit where the market is. Because most students will be what we would normally think of as non-traditional students. Recent immigrants, Gulf War, returning veterans, single parents returning back to school, people my age going back for sometimes a second or third degree. That's the great trend. That all favors the for-profit universities.
That feeds exactly into Christensen's kind of arguments, which is that you have the preferred customer pool, which is like the high-end customers that are going into the top type universities that a lot of the places, the middles are clamoring for also. But then you have the unwanted customers, which the for-profits are happy to.
It's a remarkable point. It's a remarkable point. And the interesting thing is that almost no one who's doing planning in higher education is aware of the innovator's dilemma.
So typically in industries, when a brand becomes that important, you get franchising. So if you take a look at what's happening in healthcare, you start to see, a lot of major hospitals now have their remote centers that they bought up smaller hospitals. Do you see that happening with universities?
Oh, it's happening already with the for-profits. So the for-profits, and it's reverse branding. So what they're doing is they're going out and buying a small religious college in the Midwest that already has a brand, and they're moving in and running it as a for-profit. Antioch is a perfect case in point. So the Antioch College that graduated Coretta Scott King, disappeared, but the online Antioch University is still growing its enrollment. So it's like a reverse takeover almost. The other thing that's happening, I think, and I mentioned Coursera and Udacity with some malice forethought. You find institutions like Stanford who are taking this great brand and the great reach that they have with a worldwide set of stakeholders and saying, well, we can reach, Abelard style, we can reach that group of stakeholders with technology in ways that we couldn't 50 years ago. Why don't we figure out how to do that?
They also are doing, not necessarily Stanford, but places like Cornell, doing campuses offshore.
Yes.
In Singapore, Malaysia, and places.
Yeah, turns out to be a really bad business choice for most of them. Yeah.
Seems to me, I'm never convinced of that.
Yeah.
You say that there's some. I'd like to read the report about the underproduction of graduates. I mean, there are also reports that we're going to be very short of IT-related fields.
Software engineering. Software engineers are being underproduced at the undergraduate level at an astounding rate.
What I want to do is encourage, more historians, art history people, and things like that, necessarily.
Yeah. So this gets back to my Stanley Fish problem, right? How do you deal with humanity? It's not as if the liberal arts were doing a terrific job. I have to say at the outset, there's a great study by a guy named Richard Ahrams who tracked 2,300 students across 1,000 institutions to figure out whether there was any measurable difference in having taken the general ed requirements at a university versus not. And general ed requirements are by and large humanities and liberal arts. Almost half of the time, you can't tell whether or not someone has been through the first 2 years of college. So what does this say about how we're teaching critical reading skills, writing skills, quantitative reasoning? We're doing a horrible job of it. So maybe the solution to the problem is to find an integrated way of teaching the humanities within, Harvey Mudd style, within a technical curriculum. Now, no one quite knows how to do that at scale, but it's certainly an approach to that same issue. Yes.
You spoke of the unwanted students. What exactly did you mean by that? Do you mean academically underprepared?
Well, it's more that when you look at the the MITs and the Cornells and places like that, they're going after the very top tier students, right? And more these middles also want to compete for the best students because that's what increases their numbers and makes them seem better. And the people who are the worst, often economically disadvantaged, or like you said, they're single parents going back to school, or they're trying to retool for a new job. They're kind of the lower performers are from the wrong zip codes. They're they don't have the educational background. They don't have the grades, and the top universities don't even want to look at them. And they're going to these places which are okay, I can pay a certain amount of money and I can get the training, the certification, or a degree, and I can get the job that I want to get, and that's providing me the value that I really need. And so that's where these for-profits are cleaning up.
But is that training rather than, quote, education?
Well, it's hard to argue. So one of the things that, Christensen's, and I'm sure that you talk about some of these numbers too, is that if you look at the outcomes, the dollar that they get back for the dollars that they put into the education, it's often much better for the high end of these for-profit places than it is for the low end
That I
and the
can
middle.
believe, yeah, that I can
So
believe.
for the people who are paying for this education, it matters to them.
Right, right. And again, come back to the Richard Aram study. It's not as if the things that we were passing off as education were all that effective. You know, we inflate grades, we have horrible outcomes. Yep.
I heard a great talk by Hal Edelson at the Edge Cause meeting in October, I think it was, and he had a quote here from the Dean of Libraries to students, and it says, as an academic institution, USC's purpose is to promote and foster the creation of intellectual property. And Hal thought that was a pretty bad mission statement.
Oh man, we can go another 2 hours on that.
But how also you see Stanford and MIT now doing, MIT did open courseware, and now they're doing these courses that people can sign up for. Isn't that going to leach away from the middle ground?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So what is if I can learn quantum entanglement from Leonard Susskind at Stanford, what do I need to have a course at my local teachers college in physics for? Why wouldn't you just do that? And the argument has to be, I mean, there is an argument to be said that we probably have too many people teaching those kinds of courses. If you just do a strict money ball, I did a money ball analysis of the amount of money spent on introduction to computer science courses, and I haven't published it, so I'm not going to give you the exact numbers. Let's just say there's $1 gazillion spent across this country on teaching introductory computer science, and there's no corresponding value associated with that. Do students end up performing well compared to international competition? No. Do they do well on standardized tests? No. Does a place like Microsoft believe the grades that they get? No. That's why you bring people in and subject them to a day's worth of on-campus interviews. So those universities have to figure out what their value is, and it can't be, a world-weary professor standing up in front of a class and giving exactly the same lecture that's been given for the last 25 years. There has to be some aspect of mentoring that goes in.
So nowadays, books are kind of a different kind of animal because you can have a lot of this content on the web. And as you go through the nation and talk to many different people and come to more conclusions, are you planning to kind of keep a log so that we can follow your insights, what new things you find and so forth?
Yeah, things are moving too fast.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's why it's so beautiful to have technology, and actually, as you move around with this seed that you have, then continue pursuing the ideas and maybe create a Facebook page or something like that.
Yeah.
It's
a good idea. Yeah.
I tried to download your book and was technologically unsuccessful.
Well,
is it is there a secret?
Yeah, you could just go to Amazon.
Go to Amazon.
I want to come back to this issue that you raised right at the beginning, which is this, what I consider to be unsustainable growth of the cost of education.
And the price.
The price in the public universities. And do you see, so something is going to fall off a cliff here at some point for a lot of these universities. Are any of them starting to wake up now, starting to understand what they have to do in order to make the price correspond more closely to the cost so that they don't crash?
The problem is that all the pressures are on the wrong pressure points in the system. So you have the administration threatening to penalize universities that have price increases above a certain percent. Much better to look at institutions that cut back on what they do. So the University of Chicago made it perfectly clear that you can be a really good university and not field a Division I or II football team. Well,
that's been true for many
You know, it's true for 119 BCS schools. It's true for the 119 schools that send the field football teams that are eligible for bowl games lose money hand over fist. The median loss is $10 million.
By having a football team.
Median loss is $10 million. Rutgers last year lost $38 million, which was almost precisely the amount of money it lost from the state in terms of appropriations. So what would happen, as I've suggested, if there were a new Glass-Steagall Act for intercollegiate athletics that put an institutional wall between intercollegiate athletics and higher learning, make it impossible for a university to give athletic scholarships, make it impossible for athletic teams to recruit on behalf of the university. Universities can license their name and logo to a privately held company, but that company has to live or die on its own balance sheet. It can't infect the university. You mentioned intellectual property. How many intellectual property licensing offices lose money hand over fist? They exist only to employ the lawyers that negotiate the agreement. Six institutions make money on technology licensing. This week, the Association of University Technology Licensing Managers is being held. And there are 2,300 offices represented. Not people, offices. 2,300 universities. 6 only make money.
Another tendency that I noticed is in public universities accepting more students from out of the state so that they get more tuition money from those students.
It's bowing to the pressures, yeah.
They still want the cream.
Still want the cream, yeah.
No, but still, that's one way in which they can increase the tuition money.
There are exceptions. Michael Crow at Arizona State looked at Arizona State's mission and said, Arizona State is not going to grow into a great university by becoming more and more selective. We're going to grow by setting a threshold above which any citizen in Arizona can attend Arizona State. And the threshold that he set just strikes me as a common sense. So the admission requirements at Arizona State are basically what they were at Berkeley in 1960. Be average in high school, good test scores, recommendations from teachers, an appropriately challenging high school curriculum. That will get you into Arizona State. It's a different. There's an example of a president who has not shied away from taking risks. Yes.
So I want to ask you a what went wrong situation. So a close to home example. We have University of Washington right across the way. The state of Washington has a great deal of jobs to offer in software development. They have a very fine computer science department. But unfortunately, at this point, 4 to 5 kids from within UW that are trying to get into that program are turned away. And they are then forced into other majors that they really didn't want to go into. And so what went wrong? Is that a problem with the tenure system? Is it just what's happening?
It's hard to fault tenure there. I mean, at some level, it's a fault of institutional leadership for just year after year accepting the status quo until it becomes no longer acceptable to the people paying the bills. I mean, that's the way it is in Georgia. That's the way it is in most.
Status quo in the distribution of places.
Just in the way that we do business. In the way that we do business. Yeah.
I formerly worked at UW, and I knew many students who, for instance, weren't accepted into the business school because it was full, so they majored in economics, a liberal art. That was kind of the backup. So,
but business schools are ranked on the basis of their selectivity. So the reason the business school was filled was.
Well, I'm assuming that's the same reason that the computer science programs are limited.
There has never been, as far as I know, a pact between a public university, and I'm speaking only of publics now, a pact between a public university and a state legislature to cut the cost of general ed requirements by a fixed percentage. You know, if at UW, if at any of the large state institutions, there was a program put in place to make it half as expensive 5 years from now to go through the first 2 years of a college curriculum with better outcomes, I think the conversation would be different. I don't know if it would be better, but it would be different.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.